2020, as you have heard us say many times, obviously, you know, it's a year like none other. But here's a really interesting note, though, pun intended. How is it going to change our music? How are we going to look back at 2020 and say, hey, what was our music doing? What were the artists doing during that time? Well, guess what? Spotify trends expert Shannon Cook is joining us with a little bit of details on that. Shannon, good morning. I've talked a lot about this. I'm kind of looking back to 2020, and I'm just so intrigued. I can't wait to see what's written and said about this, 20, 30 years later from now. And music has been a huge component to what has changed this year.
Oh, for sure, for sure. And we've seen some really interesting trends on Spotify, actually, that sort of were influenced by the pandemic and by quarantine in particular, which we can get to in a little bit. But I'd love to share with you the most streamed artists of the year. These are the artists who, in spite of the pandemic, managed to really thrive and be quite prolific in 2020. Our most streamed artist in particular, he released 3 albums this year. The pandemic did not slow him down. He is the Puerto Rican rapper Bad Bunny. How's that for a name for an artist? Not to be confused with Good Rabbit. He, like I said, he released 3 albums, and his most recent album, which came out a couple of weeks ago, is now on top of the Billboard charts. He's had this meteoric rise in the last 2 years, and his music streamed more than 8 billion times on Spotify. Drake was our second most streamed artist of the year. He's no stranger to our top lists. And our third most streamed artist was another Latin artist, J Balvin. It was a particularly good year for Latin music, actually.
I was just going to say that. Wow. Yeah. Well, and it's interesting that these artists did so well streaming wise when, they didn't have concerts to promote their new music. They weren't doing shows night after night.
Exactly. And I think for some artists that afforded more downtime. And so they had more time to perhaps focus on writing songs and innovation. We've seen a lot of innovation from artists this year. Like, how do we make music and record it and release it without being able to actually get into a studio? How do we maintain contact with our fans and interact with them in new ways, because we can't go to concerts and see them and stand in front of them? So we've actually seen some real creativity coming from artists this year, and I think that perhaps in the next 2 years to come, we're going to see some of the fruits of their labor, of having more time to sit down and perhaps refocus how they deliver music.
So any other particular musicians that you want to mention this morning that had a really remarkable 2020?
Yeah, sure. We've mentioned the dudes. I should mention the ladies. Our most streamed female artist of the year was Billie Eilish. She had a fantastic year in 2019. She had this debut album, which just made her sort of soar to the top of success. And that she didn't release an album this year. That debut album, continued its momentum this year. Our second most streamed artist female artist was Taylor Swift. She released an album during quarantine called Folklore. It's been hugely popular. And then there's Ariana Grande, who also managed to release some new music this year. And she's always a favorite with Spotify. She's our third most streamed female of the year.
We only have 30 seconds left, but I want to get your thoughts on podcasts, because I feel like podcasts were already super popular going into 2020, but then I feel like they've exploded, right?
Yeah. I mean, we now have more than 1.9 million podcast titles on Spotify. And I think some people had more downtime this year to listen, and they experimented with their podcast listening. We saw a lot of interest in news-focused podcasts, TED Talks Daily, and The Daily, the news podcast produced by the New York Times. Our most popular podcast, though, is the Joe Rogan Experience, Joe Rogan, very popular figure in the podcast space.
Yeah. Well, Shannon, this was certainly fun to look back on 2020. But again, I like that you said we're going to still, get into this the next 2 years on how this year has shaped everything that we are listening to and will continue to change. We appreciate your time. Happy holidays.
Same to you. Thanks for having me.